Learn Japanese history. Welcome to your deep dive.
We are Taro and Hanako, your navigators.
And we're specially talking to you, our listener. Maybe you're a university student from overseas, just starting to get into Japanese history.
Exactly. And
Mhm.
today, we're diving into a really pivotal time, the late 1920s in Japan.
It's a fascinating period. Lots happening internally, but also big shifts in how Japan related to, well, its neighbors, especially China.
Absolutely. We'll be looking at those changes in China, some pretty serious economic trouble back home in Japan, and all that pushed Japan's foreign policy in a new direction.
Yeah, understanding this little window, the late 20s, it's really key. It sets the stage for so much that happens later, don't you think?
Couldn't agree more. It's foundational.
Okay, so where should we start? China sounds like a good place. Things were really changing there.
Definitely. Let's start with the shifting sands in China.
So what was the big picture there? Late 20s.
Well, starting around 1926, you see this unifying force really emerge. Chiang Kai-shek and his Kuomintang, the Nationalist Party.
Okay, the nationalists. Where were they based?
They started out down south, in Guangzhou, or Canton, as it was often called. And from there, in 26, they launched this huge military campaign, the Northern Expedition,
Northern Expedition.
Right.
Right, and the goal was,
to unify China. I mean, China was really fragmented at the time, lots of regional warlords controlling different areas. The Nationalists wanted to bring it all under one government.
makes sense. How did they do?
Pretty well, actually, at least initially.
Yeah.
By 1927, they'd pushed north all the way to the Yangtze River, which is a major landmark.
Okay, so China is potentially unifying under a single government. How did Japan react to that? I imagine not everyone was thrilled.
You're spot on. Reactions in Japan were, well, mixed and pretty concerned in some quarters.
Like who?
You had the more radical types in the military getting quite worried. The main opposition party at the time, the Rikken Seikai, they were voicing concerns too.
And business interests.
Oh, absolutely. Business people with investments in China, plus various nationalist groups, they were all watching very closely. And frankly, they weren't happy with the government's approach.
What was the government doing? Or not doing?
The cabinet in power then, under Wakatsuki Rajiru, with Shidehara Kijiro as foreign minister, was pursuing a policy of non-intervention, trying to stay out of China's internal conflicts.
And the critics didn't like that.
Not at all. They called it weak diplomacy. They argued it wasn't protecting Japanese interests, economic, strategic, as this new nationalist force gained ground in China.
So internal divisions in Japan about how to handle a changing China, that's clear. But you mentioned domestic troubles too, economic problems.
Yes, big time. Japan had been kind of stuck in an economic slump for much of the 1920s anyway. It wasn't a boom time.
And then something specific happened.
Then in 1927, it blew up into a full-blown financial crisis.
Whoa! What sparked it?
A big trigger was this lingering issue of promissory notes, basically IOUs issued after the Great Kanto earthquake back in 1923.
Ah, the earthquake debt.
Exactly. And it turned out many banks were holding a lot of these, plus other bad loans. When that became clear in 27, confidence just evaporated.
Leading to?
Bank runs. People panicked, rushed to pull their money out because they feared the banks would collapse.
And did they?
Many did, yeah. It was chaos. There's this famous picture, of the Tokyo Nakano Bank in 1927, just crowds outside, desperate. Really shows the human impact.
That sounds terrifying.
Well-
Was there a particular bank at the heart of it?
The Bank of Taiwan was in deep trouble. It had loaned huge amounts to a company called Suzuki Shuten.
Suzuki Shuten.
Yeah, a trading company that grew super fast during World War I, but was now really struggling. The bank basically couldn't get its money back and was facing collapse.
So what did the Wakatsuki government try to do?
They tried to issue an emergency imperial decree, like a special order, to bail out the Bank of Taiwan.
Did it work?
Nope. The Privy Council, which advised the emperor, blocked it. That was a huge blow to the government.
Enough to bring them down.
Pretty much. The Wakatsuki cabinet had to resign.
And who took over?
General Tanaka Jichi from the Rikken Seikai, the party that had been criticizing Wakatsuki's weak diplomacy.
Okay, so Tanaka's in charge now, facing this financial meltdown. What's his move?
He acted fast. First, a 3-week moratorium basically paused all debt payments to stop the panic.
Freeze everything.
Essentially, yeah. And second, they got the Bank of Japan, the central bank, to issue emergency loans to shore up the system.
Did that calm things down?
Largely, yes. The bank runs stopped and things stabilized, at least for the moment. They even had to print emergency banknotes because people wanted cash so badly.
Wow. So the immediate fire was out. But you mentioned the whole decade was tough economically. Did that have longer-term effects?
It really did. This slump in the 20s and then the 27 crisis, it reshaped Japanese industry.
How
You
so?
saw this trend of concentration, monopolization. The big players got bigger.
The Zaibatsu.
Exactly. The big four, especially Mitsui, Mitsubishi, Yasuda, Sumitomo. These huge family-controlled conglomerates just accumulated more and more power.
So they weren't hurt by the crisis.
Some were initially, but the crisis actually accelerated their dominance. You see, banks became even more central. We talk about financial capital, forming banks controlling industry.
And the crisis helped the big banks.
Definitely. Lots of smaller, weaker banks went under or got swallowed up by the big Zaibatsu banks. So the big five banks, including Mitsui and Mitsubishi, became even stronger.
And these Zaibatsu weren't just in banking, right? They were everywhere.
Everywhere. They formed these things called concerns, massive groups with businesses in mining, manufacturing, trade, shipping, you name it, all centered around their main bank.
So they dominated the economy.
Hugely. And because they had close ties to political parties, their political influence grew too.
Do we know, like, how much they controlled?
Yeah, there's data from around 1930. The top three Zaibatsu controlled like a huge chunk of capital in industries like mining, steel, textiles. If you look at the top eight, it's even more stark, something like 94% in electric power.
94%. Wow, that's immense control.
It really is. Economic power and political clout all bundled together.
Okay, so that's the domestic picture. Economic stress, rising Zaibatsu power. Now, let's swing back to Tanaka, the new prime minister. You said his party criticized the weak diplomacy, so did he change Japan's foreign policy?
He certainly did. Tanaka's approach, often called Tanaka diplomacy, was definitely more assertive, especially towards China.
How did that play out?
Well, remember the northern expedition in China. Tanaka sent Japanese troops into China's Shandong province 3 times between 1927 and 28.
Why Shandong?
The official reason was always protecting Japanese residents. Standard justification back then. But the real goal was pretty clear. Stop Chiang Kai-shek's forces from moving further north and threatening Japan's interests, particularly in Manchuria.
Manchuria again. It always comes back to Manchuria, doesn't it?
It really does. And Tanaka had a specific strategy there involving a local figure,
Who was that?
a powerful warlord named Zhang Zuolinen. He controlled Manchuria. Tanaka's plan was basically to use Zhang to work with him, to maintain and expand Japanese influence in the region.
Keep him on side, basically.
Kind of, yeah.
Yeah.
Keep Manchuria friendly to Japanese interests through him.
But something went wrong. You mentioned a Manchurian certain important incident. Sounds like code for something bad.
It was very bad. In June 1928, Zhang Zuolin was assassinated. His train was bombed near Mukden. That's Shenyang now.
Assassinated. By who?
Elements within the Japanese Kwantung Army, the Japanese army stationed in Manchuria.
Japanese officers killed the warlord they were supposed to be working with. Why?
Well, some radical officers in the Kwantung Army decided Zhang wasn't reliable anymore. They thought they could trigger a crisis, take over Manchuria directly, and set up a new regime that Japan could control completely.
Did they have orders? Was this official policy?
No, not really. It seems to have been planned by mid-level staff officers, maybe without full approval from the very top command of the Kwantung Army. And it backfired.
How so?
Zhang Zuolinen's son, Zhang Suiliang, took over. And instead of being a Japanese puppet, he eventually declared allegiance to Chiang Kai-shek's nationalist government. So Japan's plan to control Manchuria got much more complicated.
Wow. So the secret plot actually hurt Japan's goals. Were there news reports?
There were reports about the bombing, yes. But initially, Zhan's death was covered up. The news just called it an incident. The truth was kept quiet for a while.
So Tanaka's being assertive in Manchuria. Things are getting messy. Did he completely cut ties with the West, though?
No, that's an important point. It was a bit of a balancing act. While being forceful in China, Tanaka's government still tried to maintain cooperative relationships with Western powers.
Any examples?
The big one is Japan signing the Kellogg-Briand Pact in 1928. This was this international agreement renouncing war as a tool of national policy.
So condemning war while assassinating warlords seems contradictory.
It does, doesn't it? It really shows the complex pressures and maybe conflicting aims within the Japanese government at the time.
Let's quickly touch on domestic politics again around this time. There was a big election in 1928.
Yes, the first one, under universal male suffrage, all adult men could vote for the first time.
Did that change things much?
Well, it saw the rise of some new parties, so-called proletarian parties like the Labor Farmer Party. They actually won a few seats, which was significant, though they were also kind of split internally.
But the government wasn't exactly welcoming these new left-leaning groups.
Not at all. Right after the election, the Tanaka cabinet launched a major crackdown using the Peace Preservation Law.
What was that law?
It was a tool to suppress dissent, basically, aimed at socialists, communists, anyone seen as a threat to the state. Lots of arrests. This is known as the March 15th incident. So suppressing dissent at home while being aggressive abroad.
Okay, now back to that Manchurian certain important incident, the assassination of Zhang Zuolin. How did that fallout play out for Tanaka?
It became a huge problem for him. As we said, it was Kuomintang army officers. They even tried to blame it on the Chinese nationalists initially.
But Tanaka found out the truth.
Yes, he got reliable, top-secret intelligence confirming Japanese military involvement.
So what did he do? He couldn't just ignore it.
Well, the opposition parties, like the Rikkin Saitu, started asking very pointed questions in the Diet, Japan's parliament. They smelled a rat.
Pressure building.
And not just from the opposition. Key establishment figures like the elder statesman Sayonji Kinmochi and the imperial household minister Makino Nawaki were pushing Tanaka hard.
Why? What were they worried about?
Japan's international reputation, for one,
And
and discipline within the army. They felt this rogue action needed to be dealt with properly.
So did Tanaka try to investigate, punish the officers?
He initially intended to.
Huh?
He apparently told the emperor he would hold a court-martial, a military trial, to get to the bottom of it and punish the guilty. He faced massive resistance. From within his own cabinet, especially the army minister, and from the army leadership itself. They did not want a public court-martial exposing the army's actions.
Could Tanaka force the issue?
It was difficult. He was technically retired from the army himself, so his direct control over the active military was limited.
So what happened to the officers involved?
In the end, the truth was swept under the rug. The officers involved weren't court-martialed. They just received some administrative penalties, basically a slap on the wrist for supposedly being negligent about security. No admission of assassination.
And this cover-up finished Tanaka.
Essentially, yes. He'd told the emperor one thing, court-martial, and then delivered something else, minor penalties, cover-up. This discrepancy, this contradiction, led to him losing the emperor's confidence. Amid all the criticism, his cabinet was forced to resign in 1929.
Another cabinet falls. Who comes next?
The Rikkin Seiko comes back to power, led by Hamaguchi Yuka.
Okay, the Hamaguchi cabinet. What was their big focus? Back to economics.
Very much so. Their finance minister, Inui Jinosuke, pushed for fiscal austerity, cutting government spending and industrial rationalization, trying to make Japanese industry more efficient, cut costs, lower prices.
All aimed at making Japan more competitive internationally.
Exactly. And the centerpiece of this plan was a very specific and ultimately controversial policy move.
Which was?
Lifting the gold export embargo. In January 1930, Japan went back onto the gold standard.
Back to gold. Why was that controversial? It sounds stabilizing, maybe.
Well, the timing couldn't have been worse. Just a few months before, October 1929, the Wall Street crash had happened in the U.S., the start of the Great Depression, the world panic.
Oh, right. So Japan ties its currency to gold just as the global economy tanks.
Precisely. It was disastrous.
Yeah.
Suddenly, Japanese exports, priced in gold-backed yen, were expensive. Foreign goods became cheaper in Japan.
So exports slump, imports flood in.
And Japan's gold reserves started draining out of the country at an alarming rate. It threw the economy into chaos.
Which parts of the economy suffered most?
The raw silk industry was hit incredibly hard. Japan exported huge amounts of silk, mainly to the U.S., and that market just collapsed.
And silk was important for...
Rural Japan. Sericulture raising silkworms was a vital source of cash income for millions of farmers. When the silk price crashed, it devastated the countryside. This whole period of intense hardship is known as the Showa Depression.
Showa Depression. You can find photos, right, of the hardship.
Yeah, pictures of kids gleaning fields, trying to find leftover crops. It shows how bad things got.
And Japan was kind of going against the international tide here. Too many other countries were actually banning gold exports to protect themselves, while Japan did the opposite.
So this economic policy, the return to gold, it was a failure.
A major failure. And it absolutely shredded public trust in the political parties, in the Hamaguchi government, and also in the big zaibatsu, who were seen as benefiting while ordinary people suffered.
Did the government try anything else to fix the economy?
Later, in 1931, they passed the Important Industries Control Law. This actually encouraged industries to form cartels to control prices and production, kind of an early step towards the more state-controlled economy we see later in the 30s.
Okay, so massive economic problems. What about foreign policy under Hamaguchi? Did they stick with Tanaka's assertiveness?
No, they tried to swing back towards Shidahara's cooperative diplomacy, trying to work more with the international community.
But was that easy, given everything happening?
It was increasingly difficult. Anti-Japanese feeling and nationalism were rising in China, making cooperation harder. And then came another major international issue, naval disarmament.
Ah, the London Naval Treaty.
Exactly. In 1930, Britain called a conference in London to try and limit naval shipbuilding, particularly for auxiliary ships, cruisers, destroyers, submarines.
And Japan participated.
Yes, Hamaguchi sent a delegation, including former PM Wakatsuki again. They negotiated and eventually signed the London Naval Treaty, which set ratios for auxiliary ship tonnage between Britain, the U.S., and Japan.
Sounds reasonable, but it caused trouble back home.
Big trouble. Hardliners in the Japanese Navy were furious.
Why? What was their objection? They felt the treaty limits, especially for heavy cruisers, were unfair to Japan and compromised national security. But their main argument was procedural, almost constitutional.
Which was?
They claimed the civilian cabinet, by agreeing to the treaty against the advice of the Navy General Staff, had violated the prerogative of the Supreme Command,
Meaning
the Emperor's direct authority over the military. They argued the Navy leadership reported directly to the Emperor on operational matters, and the cabinet couldn't overrule them on fleet size. It was a very serious charge.
And did others support the Navy's view?
Oh yes, nationalist groups jumped on it. And the opposition party, the Rikken Seikai, used it to attack the government relentlessly. It became a huge political firestorm.
You can see the photos of Wakatsuki at the conference looking serious. So the numbers.
Yeah.
Did Japan get what it wanted?
Not entirely. There were compromises. They got close to the 70% ratio compared to the US and UK that they wanted for smaller ships, but for large cruisers it was lower, around 60%. The overall ratio is just under 70%, which fell short of what the Navy Command had demanded. It felt like a diplomatic defeat to many.
And this controversy had violent consequences.
Tragically, yes. In November 1930, Prime Minister Hamaguchi was shot at Tokyo Station by a right-wing youth, someone enraged by the treaty.
Shot. Did he survive?
He survived the initial shooting, but died from his wounds the following year.
Wow. Assassinated over a naval treaty.
It really shows how high the tensions were. Hamaguchi's death was a massive blow to the idea of cooperative, civilian-led foreign policy. It really felt like things were spiraling.
So if we pull back and look at this whole period, the late 1920s,
Yep.
It feels like a pressure cooker.
Absolutely. You've got the changes in China, this deep economic crisis, and the rise of the zaibatsu at home, Tanaka's assertive diplomacy, and the Manchurian incident mess. Then Hamaguchi's attempt to fix the economy backfiring into the Shuchua Depression, and finally this huge fight over the London Naval Treaty ending in assassination.
They're all connected, aren't they? Each problem feeding into the next.
Deeply intertwined. It
Yeah.
created this environment of profound instability, transition, lots of anxiety, lots of anger,
Definitely sounds like it was setting the stage for even more turbulent times ahead.
without a doubt. Which leads us to a final thought, maybe something for you, our listener, to chew on.
Okay.
When you see this level of economic hardship, like the Shuchua Depression, combined with all this political tension and the feeling maybe that politicians or international agreements are failing the country, how might that kind of atmosphere influence people? What kinds of ideas, what kinds of solutions, or maybe dangerous paths might start to look more attractive?
That's a heavy question. How do domestic problems and foreign policy crises push a nation in certain directions?
Exactly. What questions does this era raise for you about that connection? Something to think about as you continue exploring.
Definitely something to think about. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into a really crucial, complex period of Japanese history.
We hope it's giving you a solid foundation for understanding what came next. Thanks for listening.